Hey everyone, this is Alan McKay. Welcome to episode 35. I am literally just scratching the surface here, but I'm going to dive into some of the process of starting your own company, mainly starting your own studio and the process involved. So even if this doesn't interest you, the whole idea of like what goes into running a studio, bidding and getting projects and managing teams and doing a lot of other stuff is really powerful. I think life lessons that you can apply to pretty much anything, because I know I have. Okay, so let's dive in.
Welcome to the Alan McKay Podcast. Alan is an Emmy Award-winning visual effects artist and mentor to many leading industry experts. Listen in as Alan talks with other industry leaders in film, video games, and visual effects about their experience, lessons, and methodology. Alan will teach you pivotal advice to fast-track your career, better your skills, and reach your ultimate dream job. Check out the latest episodes on alanmckay.com.
Hey everyone, this is Alan McKay. Welcome to episode 35. This episode is a big one, but basically I'm going to go through a portion of if you ever wanted to start your own company, especially if you ever wanted to start your own studio. I want to go through just some of the insight into what goes into it. Again, this is such a massive subject, so I literally just scratched the surface of this, but there is a lot of really valuable information in here. I'd say, if anything, this is probably one of those episodes that if this interests you, it will be one of the most valuable episodes I've ever put out when it comes to insight into both a lot of information that's quite privy to, having run a studio, as well as just in general how the studio, like how the industry, I should say, works. As you can tell, I'm a bit exhausted. I just finished this up. I've got a lot of really cool episodes coming up soon, as well as finally next episode I'm going to be announcing the reel reviews. So this will be a chance for you to get critiqued by some of the best people in the industry about your work personally, as well as doing the kind of career intensive live webinar stuff. So that's going to be another cool thing. I've got a lot coming up. I mentioned this at the end, but I will mention it now as well. If you want 10 hours of free training that I've put together over the past 2 months, it's only going to be available till the end of this week. In other words, till May 17, 2015. So May 17th, I'm going to be shutting it down because it's all property of my mentorship. But if you want to get access to this free material now, go to alanmckay.com/ash, so ASH for Ash, and that will be available just till then. But you can download it, so keep it, do what you want with it. I'm just mentioning that it will be going down at the end of the week, so get it now while you can. Beyond that, let's just get in there, guys. Okay, so first of all, who am I to talk about this stuff? What's my experience? I have, again, I'm rattling this off the top of my head, and I am terrible at doing this. I have been the owner of Catastrophic Effects since it started in 2004. Catastrophic has gone through a few different changes over the years. Basically, I started Catastrophic, June 2005, I launched Catastrophic in Australia. And that was my own studio. I had 30 employees. We did a lot of big feature films, a lot of big game cinematics, a lot of high-profile commercials. As far as I'm concerned, it was a massive success. We did really well. Now, at the same time, I ran that for quite a few years, and most of my clients were in LA, oddly enough. Even though I was in Australia, I kept a lot of those relationships in Los Angeles. And so I decided when I was 29 years old that after running this for about 4 or 5 years, that I wanted to have my life back for a little bit, that I was a bit too young to continue doing this for forever, because basically it was looking like it was successful enough that I would be doing it forever. Prior to that, I moved initially back to Australia to help set up Frantic Films Sydney, which was, at the time, Frantic Films was becoming one of the biggest studios on the planet. They were working as the primary facility on like movies like Superman Returns, where like Rhythm and Hughes and a lot of the other studios would be essentially getting assets from them, and we're getting really big. We're doing a lot of stuff. Prime Focus bought them, and everything kind of changed and shuffled around. But I initially moved back to Australia to help launch that studio. And along the way, I decided to, after doing that for a little bit, to launch my own company. I just felt it was probably a better move or better fit for me at the time. So I ended up finishing on Superman, launching my own company. Later, I came back onto Superman to help out at the very end in terms of delivering it. But I launched my own company, and initially just me, and over time built it up to about 30 employees. We did a lot of really cool shit, and it was great. And then at 29, I decided I wanted to be irresponsible again, and I closed it all down. And that was interesting because I had companies wanting to buy mine out. I actually had a few really big companies looking at purchasing Catastrophic. And I believe I get into this a little bit in this episode, but basically I decided at the last minute that I just wanted to shut it down and not sell it. And otherwise I can elaborate on this some more at some point. But essentially it's just more my philosophy of like, at least the visual effects, when you're buying a company, what you're actually buying. And for me, I kind of felt like until a company gets to a certain size, it's pretty much you. So if you leave, it's basically just buying a list of clients, and that's about it. So beyond that, I've helped assemble many teams, helped build companies. I've consulted for some really massive companies in terms of projects as well as their future as well. I don't know. It's kind of like if I get interviewed and I get asked like what movies have I worked on, I need to go on IMDb to actually look the stuff up. Same way in terms of my experience here. I've basically done a lot when it comes to, I've directed, I've produced for about, I think I mentioned this in here, but for about 3 or 4 years, like I kind of got off the box and started to produce and supervise only. And that's kind of like, where when I was 29, I decided I want to kind of get back to being an artist again, or at least by 30, I got back on the box and started having fun again. And so I'm going to go through a lot of this. I just figure it's well worthwhile at least kind of giving a little bit of insight, even though I've done a terrible job here of explaining it. But just in terms of like, I've been running studios, I've been helping manage studios and doing a lot of that stuff for quite a long time. So this is something I do have a lot of experience in, is setting up companies, helping run companies, as well as especially in visual effects, being both a visual effects supervisor for studios as well as being on the production side as well, where that means you're managing the visual effects studios. There's been a lot of stuff. So this is something where, yeah, I literally just scratched the surface, but again, if you guys love it, I have unlimited amount of background on this stuff. I can get into a step-by-step recipe on how to set up a company, as well as a literal breakdown of like how to bid on projects for feature film, for commercial, where to go to actually get your work initially, how to brand your company, how to get visibility in the first place. This episode is a bit of a free-for-all. I actually spent a lot of time putting it together, but just because I only get through about 10% of what I want to get through. But I will say that like part of what I intend to do here is kind of discourage a little bit, just kind of give a bit of reality into, working at that level. It is a lot of work, and it's not always what everyone wants or expects. Okay. It sounds cool to be able to put on your card that you own a company and whatever, but actually having employees, and I guess I don't get into as much as I intended, but having employees and having that kind of stress, for me, I actually will just mention, because I didn't mention in here, but it got to a point for me where I would be getting up at 5 a.m. I would be in the office shortly after that, and I would work frantically till about 10 a.m. when everyone else starts to roll in. And then from there, my entire day is all about them until everyone leaves about 7. And then I work till midnight on all the other business end of what needs to get done. I rarely got to do any 3D or any creative stuff. It was always either chasing up new business, dealing with clients, managing projects, a lot of time in Excel, and on-set supervision, and just trying to do bids and chase up work. A lot of client dinners and drinking. There's only been a few times in my life I've put on a lot of weight, and that definitely one of them. So that's just kind of giving a little bit of insight. But like yeah, like there's definitely, I just kind of want to paint a bit of a picture of like what to expect and what you're actually getting yourself in for. But also I go through a lot of like really great insight. Like I think this is in a way, it's a long episode, but probably one of the best I've put together in terms of just valuable content and stuff that I think you can apply, even if you have no intention of setting up a studio. You can apply a lot of this stuff to anything that you do. I really think that a lot of the foundations of how I've had a lot of my successes in the past have been based around the experiences I learned from managing a studio and managing projects. So let's get in there, okay? Okay, so one of the key things about launching your own company, your own business, your own studio, it's going to be more about like, why do it? Okay, like what is your reasons behind it? What's your intention? I think that that's the most important thing to figure out, because you need to justify it for yourself first, other than I want to launch a studio. Because I think a lot of people think that having your own business is really cool, and that is the reason why to do it, because that way you're an authority. I think a lot of people, my philosophy of like why people want to be, let's say, famous or other stuff like that, and again, that's just kind of my observation, is that a lot of people want to be an authority, right? So I always think of that when you talk to people when you're really young and everyone's like, I want to be rich and famous, or I want to own a business, I want to run companies. Whatever these kind of categories are, they're really targeting something that you're an authority on something. So typically you might work at a studio and you don't like being bossed around, so you decide, I want to start my own studio. It's because you want to be the authority. You don't want anyone to question you. You just want to be able to run stuff. I knew someone once in my life that I would ask her, like, what do you want to do with your life? And she'd be like, I just want to run multiple companies. And this was someone that at the time didn't have any real work experience outside of a few bars and stuff like that. So I would give advice like, okay, well, great. Well, maybe you should go to business school, or maybe you should focus on finding a product or a niche, something that you can jump into and start working on that and see what you can do with it. And she's like, no, I don't want to do any of that. I just want to run like multiple corporations. And you got to be able to connect the dots. And I think that, I think the best thing to do is to first validate what your intentions are, what your reasons are behind something. Because sometimes it's more of a vanity thing than it is to do with, like, I've got this idea as to how I want to run this. This is my passion, and I want to be able to work on my dream and go forth doing this. Like, if you can validate what your intentions are, rather than it being, I want power, or I want whatever, I want to be recognized as a boss, I want to put CEO on my business card, then that I think is a very, very core thing to do in the very beginning. I know when I was still in my teens, like I was 17, and I was a lecturer at university, which is a long story, but I had 3 students of mine that I actually lived with as well, which the university wasn't a big fan of. But one of them, he's in his early 30s, and he had worked in a few companies before. And I remember having a discussion with him at the time where he told me that he didn't want to work for anyone else. He wanted to set up his own company, because for him, like, he didn't like, other people bossing him around. He wanted to be the man. And I never really kind of understood that at the time. For me, my dream job was, I want to move to LA and I want to work in movies for some cool studio. And that was more where I was at. So it wasn't about like being the man or having that grandiose picture. For me, it was more about, I want to go work on my dream, which is to do cool stuff. But for him, it was, I don't want to have a boss. And I always thought that was really peculiar at the time. However, when I actually moved to Sydney to kind of pursue my career, as a parting gift, because he had launched his own studio, I ended up building the logo for his company. It was just a quick overnight thing I did as a gift. And his company he launched was Half Brick Studio, which you might be familiar with for Fruit Ninja, which they ended up developing. So that was in Brisbane, Australia, a long time ago. And Fruit Ninja, or I should say Half Brick, has a net worth of, I think, a few $100 million. It's insane. So that is just one of those situations where it's like, oh, okay, I don't really get it at the time, but later it's like, wow, okay, you've got that mindset, that mentality, and for you to actually go out and do it, it's pretty fascinating. So actually, a few of my students are at that company, and I think now the CEO is worth something like $80 or $100 million. So it's kind of amazing to kind of see these guys that when we're all really young kind of grow out to be these major successes. So at the same time, maybe your motivation is that you, like I said, don't want to be bossed around, or you see your studio like you're being paid, let's say $200 a day to work there, and you might find out that, okay, the studio actually charges you out at like $1,000 a day. So you might think, wow, if I were to go and start my own studio, then my freelance rate would be 5 times what I currently charge, like as if you're giving yourself an instant promotion or something. So you got to understand the logistics behind it. I mean, that mentality I did want to mention really quick, just because I've had discussions recently with a few people where they've said, well, my company bids me out for this much money, so I'm going to go freelance, and that's my rate when I freelance because they charge that much. But they don't realize that what actually gets considered or taken into consideration with that bid is a lot more than just you. Typically, the bigger the company, the more that's going on behind the scenes. Like, you doing your work physically is one thing, but while you're doing that, there's producers, there's managers, there's all these other people, as well as this studio facility overhead that is essentially being distributed through everyone's rate. So when they're charging, let's say $1,000 or $800 a day, depending on where you go, you can actually find a lot of this information out by contacting studios and asking for their studio rate card. So I noticed, like, at least a decade or so ago, like MPC, Framestore, a few of the biggest studios in the UK, they had all that stuff actually on their website. I'm pretty sure they wouldn't these days, but that was something you could freely download, and you could see like what they charge per day for everything. So you could see like how much a 3D artist costs, or how much they would charge for a flame session. And it's kind of really interesting because you can start to compare your rates as a studio with others like that. And again, I highly doubt that stuff's there now. I'd be kind of curious to take a look. But I remember probably 2005, I had a look around and I found a lot of that stuff was like publicly accessible and kind of interesting just to kind of see where you fit in. Like, maybe you're overcharging, and if MPC or someone like that is able to charge a certain rate and you're charging more, maybe it's worth kind of tailoring back a little bit, because you're probably going to need to underbid them slightly rather than come in as the premium studio. But it is important to keep that in mind, that when you go to launch a studio, there's so much going on behind the scenes. Like, you need to worry about like electricity, software licenses, rendering hardware, facilities, like if you have like a tape deck or anything like that you're paying off, you got to distribute that over a few years of jobs and kind of infuse that into a few of your bids. At the same time, anything that you're purchasing, your espresso machine that you bought, it's still going to need to kind of come from somewhere. So a lot of this stuff essentially gets kind of trickled into multiple bids, and that's how you pay stuff off. If you were to buy something that's specifically for that project, you might put that into the bid, but other times you're going to probably spread it out over multiple projects. If it's something that's more like, we need desks for all the new artists, you're not going to charge one project all these extra charges for desks and other stuff that they're not specifically hiring you for. But this is kind of like how you need to figure it out. And as an artist, like, you might say, okay, well, and I will get into bidding later on, but as an artist, you might say, okay, well, that person charges $200, but then we also need to worry about the producer, the 2 production coordinators. We also have, air conditioning and all these other things that actually cost a lot of money, and you need to take all that into consideration. So you might work out that the air conditioning for a big facility and for cooling the machine room and all the render nodes and everything else you have in there might cost X amount a month, and all these other things cost a certain amount. and you need to spread that through all these different people's rates. So usually you can't justify that by saying, okay, well, this person costs $300 a day instead of $200, and I'm going to make $100 profit on them. But in addition to that, I'm charging you for all these other ridiculous things that just won't make sense, and it's more confusing for anyone to look at on a bid. So essentially it's more you spread the stuff out over a lot of stuff. But I have seen that so many times where artists will say, well, they're getting this much money from me. And it's like, no, they're actually charging for a lot more. It's something that, you've got to take all the studio overhead into consideration. It's not you're getting, every hour that you do, they're getting so much money for. They've got to consider revisions and a lot of other stuff that all kind of gets tailed into that bid. They're not actual physical man days. Like, if you work 10 days and they bid at 8, it's not like they're going to send in a new bid necessarily for 10 days. Again, depending on if it's a fixed bid or what it's going to be. But figuring that stuff out, like, it is well worthwhile saying, okay, well, what are my reasons? Is it because I want to make more money and I think that being a studio owner is the way to go? Or because I want to be able to, make these amazing projects and have my hands in a lot of stuff? You need to kind of figure that stuff out very early on, because just saying like I want to make money isn't a intelligent thing to do. Anyone who runs a business, you're always at risk. And actually that's a good point. A lot of people think like, well, so-and-so is making all this money off of me. And I actually have heard this a few times even in the past week, where I've heard artists saying that the company they work for is making all this money off of them, and therefore like they'd rather go do it for themselves. What they are not considering is the fact that that person or that company is actually the one who's liable for everything. So if they don't deliver the project, they can get sued. If they don't get projects in, they will owe a lot of money to all their employees. So if one of their employees gets hurt on the job, they could sue. There's all these different things. It's a lot of responsibility, a lot of stress. And as an employee, you pretty much just have to show up for work and get told what to do. And it's a pretty chill, pretty non-stress position to be in. I remember when I closed my studio and I went, a little bit later than that, but I went to go work on Priest. Going from being a supervisor and having a lot of responsibility to this being the first project I had done just as a standard. I was a lead on Priest. And I remember Mike Janoff, the VFX soup, he's over at ILM right now, and he was VFX souping Priest for a studio in San Francisco. I remember him coming up to me a few times saying like, Alan, like, are you cool with just doing this? Like, are you happy? Really kind of concerned about whether or not I would be, I would feel challenged enough, and I was happy with just the position I was in on that project. And, I remember saying to him like, dude, I don't need to go to meetings. I don't need to worry about, for the most part, other artists. I need to help out a few of the effects team we had, but nothing that crucial. Like for me, I'm pretty much just need to worry about the shots that are on my screen. And for me, it was a vacation. It was like such a great experience just to be able to say, I get to do 3D and I don't need to worry about being in meetings all day or all the other stress going on. I get to chill. This is awesome. I'm more than happy. And for me at the time, like that was cool, because there are lots of times when you're on a production, like every bit of responsibility falls on you for everything going on, and you've got to make decisions that can come back to bite you in the butt all day long as well. So I mention all this because it's so easy to just say, oh, well, like, that person runs this company and I could totally do what they do and I could make all this cash. But first of all, a lot of the time, the profit that you get from a company, you're infusing back into the company. It's not until really later on that you're actually going to get to start to see a little bit of the worth of it. And even then, it's more you might be worth. In other words, your net worth might be X amount of money, but what you physically have isn't necessarily going to be that high. It's not like you have a couple of $1 million sitting in your bank account. It might be that your company is worth X amount of money, but you're still paying yourself a salary. And that's more of a tax thing as well. But typically you're still going to be an employee of the company you own, and you see a certain amount of money. There is advantages that you can pay for stuff through your company and all that stuff, but it's not like you're Scrooge McDuck swimming in cash all day long. And like I said, the liabilities and the stress that comes with it way outweigh the fun of like, okay, if I'm an employee, then I get to pretty much do whatever I want to do, and if I mess up, or if the project messes up, or we lose the project, worst that's going to happen is I may lose my job, which again is a terrible thing, but it can be a lot worse for other people who are the ones who run the company and everything else. So you need to take in consideration like the stress and all the other bad stuff that can come with running a company, and whether or not that's actually something that you are willing to have and want to have. And without having that experience, just diving in, this can be an issue. I will say that just on this subject, I don't think that saying one day, like waking up and being like, I'm gonna go and own my own animation studio, or I'm gonna be the next Pixar, is ever the way to go. And this sounds like a no-brainer, but I meet so many people who, like, I've seen this a lot actually. They'll go straight from school, like 3D school, to graduate with a few of their friends, and actually I'm completely contradicting myself right now, and I'll explain in a moment. But quitting school or graduating from school and deciding, okay, I'm going to go and set up my own company now, and then I'm going to go and make the next movie or the next video game or whatever. Typically, if you're going to do that, you don't have any experience, you don't have any projects under your belt. It's a massive gamble, and it sounds cool in theory, but the longevity, and I'm just being realistic about this, it's usually not going to work out. Now, the reason I'm contradicting myself is just because I mentioned Half Brick, and that just completely brought me back to, those guys all banding together, like Chenille and all the other guys there, and basically being like, we're going to go and start our own company, and my buddy Jason Cassar, paying up front for an office in Toowong in Australia, and basically, getting everything off the ground. And, I'll mention them because that's actually exactly the opposite, where they literally decided to set up a company, and they went and did it and made one of the biggest games ever. It's essentially like, the equivalent of Angry Birds. Those are the freak incidents, but I do know of so many other places that, a bunch of kids get together and decide they're going to do something big. And it sounds cool in theory, but like I said, it kind of goes back to what your reasons are and whether or not you're at a point where you can be successful by doing that. I think getting the experience first is always going to be key, and it's also because then you're learning the way to do things, and you're learning from your mistakes, where it's still on someone else's dime. And that's where I mentioned, like, having a boss, having a studio to work for, you can mess up, you can make mistakes, and like I said, the worst that can happen is maybe you get fired, but most of the time it's more you've got other support teams around you that if you mess up, one of the senior guys needs to take over a shot and they get it back on track, whatever. It's not the end of the world. But when you decide to play boss and get a company going and start dabbling with other people's money and you can't deliver, that's on you, and it can be a lot worse than you lose that job. It can be you get sued, you go bankrupt, you then are stuck for 5 years, like not being able to make any money, and you're a liability financially moving forward. Like, there's so many bad things that can happen, and that's why I figure it's better to do your time in the trenches, and then later, if you decide, you know what, I've got 5 years, 10 years experience, and now I've learned all this stuff, it's time for me to venture out on my own. And at that point, you're in a position where you know what to expect, you know what you're getting yourself into. But more importantly, along the way, you'll have learned the steps. Like, I do think that early on, you should be a sponge for information. You should ask why when you're working with people, and like learn from them. And essentially, like I said, get a mentor, and get out there and do stuff. And that way, you will be at a point where you know enough about things that you've gotten exposure to bids and everything else. And along the way, like, you might say, okay, I want to start a company. Well, what are the things I don't know yet, and what do I need to go and learn? And I think for me, and I've mentioned this so much about treating your career like a business, I think is so important. And I think that especially when I did launch a studio, it made me have to step up big time and start to be a producer, start to bid projects and supervise projects, and start to really kind of sit on the other end of production where I'm making sure shit's getting done. I'm making sure that we're able to deliver. I'm trying to anticipate problems before they happen. I spent a few good years, probably about 4 years, where I wasn't doing much 3D. I literally was supervising on set, supervising teams, and I was producing. I produced a lot of shows, and I wasn't doing much creative stuff. In fact, 2012 was really the first like 3D job I did in quite a few years. Like that was my first kind of crash course back into doing effects and doing 3D, and then going to ILM, and then after that working on Priest. And that to me was kind of more, I kind of felt like by the time I got back into, I was back into Max and working on Priest, that was where it kind of felt like I'd caught up, because as soon as you start to kind of get off the box and onto the floor, basically, your skills are going to diminish, and it's very hard to kind of keep your skill set up as well as keep up to date with what's going on. And it's so easy to be one of those bosses that, you tell people how you were doing things back when you're on a Quantel, and, or in how when you're doing all this stuff. The thing is, it's not relevant now. It's like, oh, great, that's awesome, but we use desktop compositing now, and we use Nuke. Things change so rapidly, and you're definitely going to fall out of the loop very quickly. And that's why, like, if you're going to be doing this and you're going to be the face of your company and you're going to be dealing with clients, you need to be able to surrender get your head out of the production. It's great to supervise, but again, I just find that it's so easy to micromanage. Like, there's a lot of psychological stuff too that comes with running a company and having employees, and it's so easy to, I think on a constant basis, you've got to be careful not to become the dick boss. And I mean, like, there's been times where I've had employees, like one of my producers would be listening, like have Entourage or whatever on YouTube or something, and kind of watching that, and on the side while they're working. And part of you is like, I'm paying this person like X amount of a year to do this work. Like, you should be working right now. And it's so easy to kind of like start to see everyone as a money, as essentially costing you money. And you really got to start to look at, like, catch yourself when you do stuff like that and step back and say, this machine is functioning properly and I'm just going to let it run. Okay. And that's the thing, is at the end of the day, like, and this is something for producers, supervisors, anyone who's not on the box, it's very nerve-wracking when you're not physically doing something in terms of having a direct effect on what's going on, to not feel like you need to justify yourself by going and talking to people and making changes just for the sake of you feel like you need to justify yourself, your existence. And that's why a lot of clients, there are going to be times when they will make ridiculous changes. Everyone is going to go through that, where they say, go do this or whatever, just because everything is fine. They just feel like if they don't, they're not doing their job. And there's this whole other kind of mindset that comes with that. And I think when you do kind of switch into a role like that, it's very difficult not to start to see it like everything is costing me money, and people need to be working. Like, I've seen some guys like kind of go a little crazy. There's someone, I don't know directly, but my girlfriend works with that basically has a security camera screen with like every single room, every single artist on it, reviews everyone's email, which I'm not even sure if that's legal or not, but reviews all of their email constantly, watches what they do, and even mentions like 3 minutes you were texting the other day or whatever. And it's the most ridiculous kind of stuff. And that kind of thing goes on. And, I think it's very easy to kind of get consumed in that kind of bullshit. And yeah, you got to kind of watch out for that. And that's what I mean. Like, as soon as you start to be the person who's paying for everything and running everything, suddenly everything becomes essentially a vacuum for your profit, and you want to get stuff done, and you got to start to put trust back in everything. So there's a lot of things I want to cover, and there's just not going to be time to go through it. But I think one of the key things as a studio you need to do is figure out your pipeline and how you're going to do stuff. Figure out the foundations of your company. That is something I am going to leave for another time. And if this is something that I decide and you guys really want to hear more about, I will elaborate really in depth into like a series of these, because a studio pipeline by itself is huge. And Carlos and Guillermo, we ended up putting out 3 episodes on this, and it was so insightful just because that's what he's trying to do, is essentially build kind of the glue to make all these studios work better. And what it really comes down to is, like, if you're not doing things properly, especially your studio pipeline, you will like literally burn all your money just by not handling things properly. So on the front end, doing that work, figuring out the best way to handle things and a process for doing everything is going to allow you to save so much money, to save so much time, and prevent there being like a lot of shit hitting the fan constantly down the line. So I think one of the number one things internally is to have a good solid pipeline and understand it. Not just say, okay, well, this is our workflow, but really figure it out to the point where you know what's going to happen every step of the way, so that way you can kind of trust in the system and let it work. Otherwise, you're going to be making changes to stuff that's already approved by the client, or you might be rendering stuff in a way that ends up becoming more of a hassle later on, or more time consuming. You might not anticipate how big things are getting because you're not looking at the big picture. I mean, there's just a billion things that can go wrong, but that is just one aspect of where it can all go wrong. I'm just being real here, but having a solid pipeline, having a good workflow, having the right people in charge to manage a show is worth its weight in gold. I see a lot of mid-sized studios that typically won't have a supervisor. They just kind of have a bunch of people doing a project, and the boss is kind of running maybe I'll say smaller studios, but the boss is usually the one who's kind of jumping into the room and managing everything. And essentially, it's very easy to derail a project by not having that person detached from that and letting someone like a dedicated supervisor be in charge of that. Also, the producer might be the one supervising the creative, and you really having a good supervisor is well worth it. Like, most people don't want to do it because you're essentially paying money for someone who probably isn't physically doing any 3D work, and so it's hard to put a justification on the money of like, okay, well, we're paying this person probably more than we're paying anyone else on the project, and they're not physically sitting on a box making a pixel or anything that we can kind of do metrics on, that we can actually measure their contribution to the project. So I will leave like the bidding. Well, I will go into bidding a little bit, but basically pipeline is everything. And you need to also figure out, like, initially you need to be MVP, like minimum viable product. You need to essentially make sure that you can bootstrap your company and keep things cheap. Going out and getting the debt or trying to look for investors in the beginning is all really terrible ideas. And that's because you're essentially giving up most of your income right off the bat. I've had a few companies in the past look at purchasing my studio when I had it. And one realization I decided on was that if your company isn't at least 50 people, then, in fact, I kind of believe it's higher than that, but as a studio, I don't think you can really sell your company, because typically what someone's doing is when they buy your company, they're really buying you and your client list. And most of your clients are going to be coming to you. They're not coming to whatever your studio is. They know you, and they trust you, and they trust the decisions, the guidance that you've been doing. So if you're to leave, then that company, there's no face to it. But if you have a company that's big enough, then typically it's the producers, the supervisors that are more running everything. So you can step away, and it's not, the whole place isn't going to collapse in your absence. And that is something that once it becomes a machine, then you can sell it. But until you get it structured to that point, I honestly think that most studios I can think of, if that person was to go, like the key face of that company, then the company wouldn't be able to get the work that it gets. So maybe you will disagree with that, but that's something that I kind of made that realization about. So when I finally did close my studio, at least when I closed it in Australia and decided to take 3 years away from it, that was because like I actually had the chance to sell it for quite a lot of money, but I felt like I wouldn't really be selling anything but my client list at the end of the day. And at one point I was talking with Keith Moore, who was one of the key people. Like, he was the president of Activision back in the 80s, I believe, and essentially responsible for bringing Activision to being the giant that it is today. And he had set up, I think it's Monarch is the company, and they were looking at buying my company and a few other businesses out and essentially building this bigger machine from that to be able to bring in work from North America, strip it down, outsource it to a lot of different areas, and reconstruct a lot of it through my business. And the idea sounds great, but once you get investors and everyone else involved, suddenly your profit margin is very minimal. And I think in this industry, there isn't that much profit to begin with. So you kind of need to take that into consideration. There's companies like Scarecrow VFX, and they're like, one of my friends is a producer there, or was a producer there. He's now at Activision. He's one of the guys who work with them quite closely in getting them all kind of up to speed. And Scarecrow is really great because they're essentially a virtual studio, and they're trying to build a studio where they bring in a lot of talent and they try and manage projects virtually rather than having a studio and studio overhead. The cost is minimal, but I think it's kind of an interesting business model because I think that there's only so far you can take it. You can't manage like a large feature film, in my opinion, completely virtually. There's too many unknowns at any given moment, too many things to track, but on a small scale, you can definitely do it. But then there's other studios. I like to think of, there's a studio, Digital Dimension, I used to work for, and they're still around. They're in Montreal, but I liked them at the time because they were a studio that completely automated everything. Everything had to be pipeline driven. The owner, Benoit Girard, he kind of saw people as being human error, and if you could remove humans from the equation, everything's going to run smoothly. I completely disagree with that, but it was interesting to compare that to a few other business models. So like Blur Studio, especially in their heyday, like 2004, I felt like they were doing phenomenal work, but it was definitely more of a garage setup. You kind of would hop on your scooter and scoot over to the other person's desk and say, the file is done, it's in this location, and that person would run over and tell someone else. It was completely kind of chaos. And I told Tim Miller, the owner, gladly that, like, I'm surprised this company is able to run, considering, how this whole thing works. But the thing is that you had some of the best people in the world all working together as a team. So everyone knew their responsibilities, they knew everyone else's. So through sheer experience, you could make that function. And so that to me was a very interesting and chaotic, but very successful. I mean, the work they're doing was phenomenal and is phenomenal. And so you go from automated to completely kind of self-manned. And then I would look at other companies like Frantic Films, which now is owned by Prime Focus. One of the owners, Chris Bond, he's gone and started ThinkBox Software, which does Krakatoa, Deadline, a lot of other really amazing software. They, at the time it was Ken Zorniak and Chris Bond, and they had a third partner who I didn't really know too well, but like Ken and Chris, they grew up together, they went to school, they've been best friends forever, and they started this company together. And I'll elaborate on them later on, but I liked their mindset of, they were a creative studio, but they also had developers. They had a bunch of really smart people working for their company, and they developed a lot of their own tools. And my philosophy was that whenever they hit a brick wall, it wasn't like, okay, well, we can't do this, time to figure out another solution. They could build over that wall. They had tools to say, okay, well, we need to create this water simulation, and the only thing out here at the time is this commercial software, so why don't we develop our own? There's all these tools they were developing constantly that they would initially build to solve their own issues, and then later on they became commercial products, like Krakatoa and Deadline being two of them. that everyone else was able to benefit from. So I really loved that whole mindset, and for me, I found it to be really effective. And then there's other companies, like you look at a lot of the older studios that were around in the beginning of VFX, and they would be more about there is no like good commercial solution, so they developed all their own custom stuff for everything. And I look at a lot of the much older studios that still are around, and how they're all very much adapting now to kind of to keep up with bidding against everyone else around these days. Have needed to kind of change their mindset, but for the longest time, everyone had their own proprietary tools, their own proprietary software, their own method of doing things. And the problem with that is you can do amazing stuff, but it's a lot more expensive. Your overhead daily is massive, but it also means that you're needing to rely on your own custom solutions for everything. And if you bring in other people, you need to train them up in your tools. It's these days it's kind of hard because everyone is trying to get the cheapest bid possible, and for doing something like that, it's very hard to kind of adapt quickly. Whereas people using custom software, commercial software, it's a lot easier to say, okay, well, we need to bring in 20 freelancers. Great. Well, let's go find people who use Maya. Let's go find people using Houdini or Max. You can bring them in very quickly. So I think that's a really key thing, is just to kind of figure out what your mindset is, figure out your pipeline, but also kind of how that works, whether, you are completely chaos and just kind of picking up bids as you go and trying to find the right freelancers for it, or whether you have that mindset of we're gonna approach things a little bit differently. I look at Scanline, they definitely started to get a name for themselves by doing custom water solutions. So Stefan wrote Flowline, which was able to do water better than anything else out there, and so bit by bit they started to get all the big water jobs, and then they expounded upon that and started to do digital humans and then destruction. Now they're well known for water as well as destruction, and it all started because they found their niche and kind of built upon that, rather than saying we'll use real flow. They're we'll develop our own tool, and it means that when we hit that wall, we can't say, okay, well, we got to fake it and figure out a solution. It's well, I'll go and fiddle around and in the kernel and try and get a newer build out that can do exactly what we need it to do. So whatever your foundations are, I think it's important to have that mindset. So with bidding, I think this is something that I will probably spend a lot of time on, and probably a majority of this. And it's kind of cool because I know there's been a lot of people emailing me more recently asking about can you tell me how to bid on projects? Again, I think whatever I do right now is just going to be scratching on the surface of this, but I think initially launching a company, I could give you guys a recipe for how to do this, but it's still, I kind of feel like that needs to be a separate episode altogether. But initially, when you do get a bid in, let's just say, they're all going to be very different. It's not typically going to be the same style for everything that you ever do. And usually you're going to need to kind of customize things a little bit specific to that client. So usually I'm just going to say that you want to break down in a bid what you're going to be charging, how much each thing's going to cost. And rather than just saying, okay, I notice you want to get CG dinosaurs for the next 6 minutes of your film, that's going to be $500,000. If you give that to a client, they're going to say, okay, well, what am I getting for this $500,000, and how did you come to that number? And I actually just recently, and I don't know whether I should mention this, but I experienced this recently where someone did kind of change their bid, literally to try and help a client out. They dropped their bid down to compensate for the fact that they needed a lower rate, but they didn't explain how they kind of dropped the bid down. And so the client kind of came back basically saying, you guys must be screwing us. If you were charging 3 times this and suddenly you give us this cheaper rate, then you basically were charging 3 times the amount, trying to screw us over. And that's pretty as far as I can kind of talk about that without kind of hopefully not giving away too much information about who or why or what the deal was. But for me, it's kind of insightful to kind of see that the money is a very sensitive thing, and that you want to educate everyone on how you came to a number and why. So I think it's very important if you were to do a shot, typically, and again, I'm happy to send PDFs and other stuff out about this if you guys want, but typically when you do a bid, you would say, okay, shot A006-52, or whatever, like, you need a background replacement, camera tracking, like, let's just say compositing is $20,000, $10,000 or whatever for it, whereas the 3D like animation is $2,000, effects is $1,000 or whatever. Total for that shot is going to be whatever it is, $13,000 or whatever. Next shot, same deal. You break it down a little bit, and it kind of just gives them a bit of insight into like, okay, I see how this is broke down. I understand the amount of work going into it as well, because sometimes you need to educate clients as to how much work is actually going into something. They actually like there's the guys West Coast Customs who does like Pimp My Ride and all those shows. Like someone I know who was talking with them recently, they were like, we want to get a vehicle done where we want to have like a car being blown up and do it all in 3D. And I had to kind of just in discussion mention like, well, if you were to do that, it's going to be a lot more expensive to do in 3D than to do it in 2D, because in 3D, to model a car that's real, and then on top of that, like to simulate explosions and to get all that stuff right, that's going to take like a good amount of time, and it gets very expensive very quickly. Whereas doing it in Photoshop or however you want to do it, that's going to be a lot more affordable. And Mad Max just recently, I got approached to do the posters for the new Mad Max movie, and they want to have like this massive sandstorm, like gigantic sandstorm blasting through. And I got offered the job. It's like, we'll pay you whatever you need. And it was one of those things where I got on the phone with the owner of the company, and this is when I was still at Activision, and I said, like, I want to talk to you about this. I'm going to ask you a lot of questions about it. And I proceeded to talk to him a lot about his budget, everything else. They were happy to pay the money like to do it in 3D, but I was basically telling them like, what you're basically going to be paying, you could get like a movie out of it. Like basically for me to do it, like that sort of effect, I need to go through the same process as if I was actually doing shots for the film. It's not like just because it's a still, it's going to be cheaper. And on top of that, for print, you're looking at 6K rather than, let's say, 2K res. So suddenly it gets expensive very quickly. And I said that at the end of the day, you're going to get about 1/12 of the cost if you just bite the bullet, do it in Photoshop, get a really good designer or painter in to like get elements and start going to town, like building this up in 2D rather than doing the 3D solution. And I think also, just on a side note, having those discussions where you're willing to say like, look, I think you're making the wrong decision giving it to me, I think builds a lot of trust. Because that way they're willing to say, okay, if that person's willing to lose the job to save me money, then, in the long run, I think that they're going to go to you and they're always going to be able to trust you a lot more. If you were to come back and say, okay, this thing's going to cost all this money, they're going to say, well, look, I know you wouldn't screw me, so I trust you. But so I think it's very interesting kind of looking at those processes. And when you're doing a bid, if you don't have that relationship, you really need to make sure it's clear like how you came to that number. But I will also say that if you don't want to go overboard and break everything down too much, and by that I mean I might say this shot cost this much money, or I might say this shot cost this much money because animation, compositing, modeling, this and this are all bidded out at this much money. I'm not going to say how long, like how many man days or any internal stuff. I'm literally just going to say this is how much for each department to do their thing. Now, giving them too much information, there's a few things that will go wrong. First of all, you can say, okay, well, it's going to take 20 days and the matte painting is this, and then, we've got to go and do all this stuff, and we got to have reviews, and I'm going to include electricity or whatever ridiculous stuff. Like, the more you divulge your information, the more it can, either there's going to be paralysis by analysis. In other words, the client is just going to be like, this thing is impossible to read and understand. They feel overwhelmed. Or what ends up happening is you've divulged so much information, then they can kind of start to get creative and say, well, you're painting this painting here and you're doing this one over here. Technically, they're pretty similar shots. Couldn't you kind of fake it or whatever? And the more you divulge about your information as well, the more you're going to be held to that. And it's pretty common in production that you may borrow time or money, some of the budget from one sequence or one shot for another shot, because one, you didn't calculate correctly and is taking a lot more time to get done than the other one. So you're like, okay, well, no worries, because like this one here was worth 20k, whereas this one here was 8, and now it's looking like it's going to cost 14. Well, we can just borrow some money from the budget over there and we're good. But the more you divulge about information about like all these shots, it's very easy for someone to start to say, well, what if we took away this, and this, because they're costing a lot of money and we could probably live without it or whatever. It's just you're opening up this massive can of discussion. So less is more anytime when you're doing bids. But you will occasionally get clients who say, well, can you elaborate more on what specifically, like where you got those costs from? So there are going to be some clients who will ask for more, but typically you're not going to put how long, all the science of what actually like got you to that, because otherwise you're giving away everything. You're basically saying, okay, well, this is how much we charge per hour and blah, blah, blah. So just having those numbers is best, and that way, you've got a bit of a buffer. You've got some money that you can kind of move around if you need to as well. So as I mentioned, like when you're trying to figure out like how much to charge for something, like when you're trying to figure out a bid, basically you've got to sit down and figure out, okay, I'm trying to do, let's say, a sandstorm. Well, I might need to go in and get someone to build the environment, okay? And that might be, let's say, 2 weeks, so 10 man days to have someone model and texture the environment. On top of that, I need an effects artist to come in and simulate a big sandstorm. Maybe that's a week. And then I need a compositor to come in and composite it all. Maybe I need someone for lighting, or I need someone to track the camera. On top of that, I need a coordinator or someone to actually kind of chase things up and make sure everything's cool, transfer files on the FTP or Dropbox or whatever to the client, sit in meetings, all that kind of stuff. Bit by bit, you start to break down all the services that are coming into this and how much they're all going to cost. So let's just say for the effects person that you said 1 week, so that would be 5 man days. Then, let's say that they're $500 a day for like a mid-level effects artist. So that's $2,500. Now, on top of that, you think of the compositor might be $600 a day. Well, okay, so that's going to be what, $3,000? And again, I'm probably going to get some of my math wrong here. I'm just freeballing it, but like this is a chance for you to kind of say, okay, well, that's $3K, $2,500, so it's $5,500. Then the environment artist for 2 weeks, so that's 10 days. Let's say they're at $400, so that's $4,000, I think. So I forget what we're up to, but so you start to kind of put it all together, and so yeah, I think $9,500. So that is what it's going to cost, like at cost. But then you need to think about, well, then we have a production coordinator. We've got all this other stuff. What about equipment? Because the effects might take a long time to do. We also need to get custom software. Maybe I need to render in the cloud. So you start to figure out all the additional costs. On top of that, you need buffer, because like, what if they have revisions? Typically, you're not going to show something the first time and they're going to say done. There's, especially in 3D, I'm just going to say my philosophy of 3D is shit will always go wrong. And I'm probably going to give a disclaimer in the beginning, but I think with this episode, I will swear a lot, just because it's kind of goes with the territory of like talking about running a business. But shit will always go wrong with 3D. 3D is such an unpredictable monster, and it's never ever like things are going to be straightforward. Like animation, stuff like that, you can usually measure animation and modeling. Modeling, you can kind of put out a rough bid and say, okay, well, that's about 5 days of work, and you'll probably be right, because it's more about broad strokes, like how much detail, like how many revisions can you get, like before you got to kind of abandon the model. Animation, you kind of figure out, okay, well, maybe we get 2 minutes done a day or however long, and you start to figure out like and measure how much animation you can get done within a certain amount of time. And so I think those things are all measurable to an extent. But for the most part, like 3D, maybe you have issues rendering stuff, or things are going to break. Anything and everything will go wrong with 3D. 2D, things that can be a pain, but usually you're going to have a more predictable grasp on how long stuff's going to take, and it's more about doing it. So, I always think that you need to buffer things correctly. Otherwise, it's so easy to screw yourself when you're putting in a bid by saying, okay, well, we'll do it for $10,000. And what I just mentioned there for having those 3 people is $9,500 at cost. So you're not even making a profit. You're literally just paying your artists. And what if one of them needs to work an extra day or needs to work overtime, and you're in a country or city that pays like time and a half or double time for, doing any additional work after 10 hours? That can blow out your budget completely. But even at $9,500 at cost, and you quoted $10,000 for the shot, technically you're already at a loss, because the software and everything else that comes into it, that money needs to come from somewhere. And what if there's revision? Suddenly you're in the red. You're needing to pay essentially to do the shot. So you need to figure out, like, okay, how much is this going to cost to do, and how much leeway am I going to have? I've worked for a lot of studios, and I've bid at a lot of shows, and everyone has a different way of doing things. I will say a pretty popular one is that you might charge like per day. Let's say $1,000 is your studio rate for most 3D artists. And, some of the more junior stuff, like maybe camera tracking, is only $300 a day, but for 3D, maybe it's $1,000 a day. Now, your artist might be $400 a day, but that doesn't necessarily mean that like you're making $600 profit on every single person. You're basically saying, okay, this shot is going to be 40 days, essentially. You're going to break it down to those 3 disciplines, but 30, 40 days, that's 30, 40 grand. From there, you need to start to figure out, okay, well, if there's additional revisions, if we need to purchase like stock footage or textures or assets, if things need, we need to go into overtime on certain things, we need to buy more render hardware to get it done. All that money is going to be kind of pulled in from certain pools. So typically that's $600 profit. If it's $400 for a person and you're charging $1,000, then there's $600, which is going to go into your general pool of money. And bit by bit, that pool is going to be paying for everything else. So, you figure out what is actual cost to do something, and then you've got all your overhead, and then you've got your profit. And typically your profit, you want it to be about 30%. And in visual effects, it's highly unlikely you're not always going to get 30%. This is definitely a pretty high versatile industry to be in, and depending on how safe you play things, going to feature film and doing stuff like that, things get expensive very quickly, and it's also a very saturated market. If you find your niche doing car commercials in Detroit or a very specific city, you can start to build a very solid foundation and get a good business going. But if you want to do something really big that everyone wants a piece of the pie, it means that you've got a lot of people who are throwing curveballs with their bids, underbidding and doing a lot of stupid stuff. It's not going to be as profitable as you might think. There's a very big European studio that is pretty much worldwide now. And that place, I remember the owner saying that for the longest time, a lot of their big European commercials they would get from Ferrari and Porsche essentially funded their feature films. So they were taking a loss for a very big time on doing a lot of the feature film work that they were doing. But they were able to do it by essentially shifting money from the commercials they did to fund the other stuff. And I've seen that a lot, where companies might underbid someone, and essentially they have like a different department or a very specific client that they consistently get that will keep them afloat. And I think that's kind of bad business, but occasionally, if you're just doing it occasionally for a bit of a gamble, fine, you've got some capital to play with here. But if you're basically saying, okay, well, we're essentially taking a loss consistently in these departments, but we have this mobile app department that does phenomenally well, and that kind of funds for us to do, all the other stuff. I think that that's a really bad business model to have, and that you need to kind of be very careful about, like, okay, well, if we're bleeding from these departments, then maybe it's worth kind of cutting our losses and, kind of sever the head of that and focus on the things that are really profitable. And that kind of comes down to good business and more about, like, I guess what your end goal is. If you're trying to break into feature film, having that money from something else short term might be the way to go, but if you're consistently taking a loss, then maybe it's time to go back to the drawing board and figure out a better way to go about it. I know plenty of studios that originally were doing certain things, like, let's say, feature film or whatever, and they've just decided, okay, now we're just going to play it safe, and we're doing Amazon commercials because Amazon's a really great client, they're our whale, and we can rely on them consistently. So the other thing I'll just throw in is, you need to think about, like, the other stuff that's going to happen too, and it's more about discussion and getting a big 360 view of what you need to deliver. And you might need to do DI or essentially grading your shots, telecine, stuff like that. You might need to worry about the final output formats. So you might need to put everything to tape, or you might need to put it on a drive and have it delivered first class, or hand deliver it, as in send someone in a plane with a drive to another country to deliver that drive to the agency, the clients, whoever it's going to be. So all that stuff you need to work into the budget, because it might be like, okay, I'll just Dropbox you the image sequence and you're done. It might be like, okay, I've got to go and deliver the sequence with slates and everything else and make sure that they're all happy, and spend a few days with them, going over everything. Maybe while I'm over there, they're going to come back with additional revisions we need to kind of figure out, whether it's a locked bid or whether it's something that if they make changes that are outside of the scope of what you guys discussed, whether or not they're going to give you additional funds to make those changes. So, there's other stuff too. I remember New York, I've had this a lot, where it seems to be a pretty common thing that a lot of the projects that I've been on for different clients too have 48 frame handles. Okay, and handles is essentially a bit of additional kind of buffer in your shots, so that way if they want to slip the edit a little bit, usually it's 8 frames is pretty standard. So 8 frame handles, so that way they get an additional 16 frames in a shot. So if a shot's a 30 frame shot, it'd be 46 frames, and that way you deliver that additional stuff. And it meant that if they wanted to make the shot start a little earlier or go a little longer, they had that there, because it would cost so much more and pretty much be a redesign of the shot to just go in and start adding additional frames. It's not that easy. You've kind of got to go back to like the beginning and transfer the additional frames and go through the whole process to get them into 3D. Maybe you got to retrack everything. It's a hassle. So doing it the first time, it's going to be a lot less work in the long run. But doing 48 frame handles, for me, that's something I've started to have to say, well, if you guys are going to do 48 frame handles, and I'm actually about to do this right now, again, and I decided to like leave the discussion for the time being, but it's one of the first things I'm going to bring up, is that we cannot do 48 frame handles. If we are, then I've got to essentially add on more time for the shots, because 48 frames is like 96 frames additional, and that can be like a whole extra shot basically. I remember God of War and a few other projects, we would have 48 frame handles, like the Witches of East End. There's a few other ones I did, and that was brutal, because basically you were creating an additional like 4 seconds for every shot, and there were shots that were only 28 frames with 48 frame handles, and that kind of thing can be pretty brutal. So there are little curveballs like that you really need to worry about, because they can really blow out everything. And same thing with delivery. Some places might say, well, we render everything overscan. So in other words, we want everything at like 2.5K res because we want to be able to render overscan. In other words, we might want to be able to pan around the shot or do a lot more with it, like pull out a little bit, do an animated crop in, anything they want to do. Same thing, like maybe it's at 4K res and you think, okay, no worries, 4K. In my opinion, working at 4K is about 300% more work, because at 4K, it's double the resolution, which means typically things are going to probably take about 3 times longer to render. There's a certain point where shots start to exponentially cost more RAM and CPU, or a GPU. And in addition to that, everything's a lot more exposed at 4K. I remember back in the 90s, like we'd always talk about like people in movies would working at 2K because we'd all be standard def, like 640, 480, working at 2K res, like 1080p around there. How much more difficult that is because everyone can see every flaw in your work and it's going to be perfect. 4K, especially 4K stereo, that kind of thing it's going to blow your budget out so much because suddenly, you can see everything and everything has to be perfect. I was having dinner recently with a few guys who will probably listen to this, so I'll give a shout out later, but we were talking about that, about doing 4K for TV and how it probably will cripple a lot of studios just because they'll not be able to handle kind of the bandwidth of doing shows that quickly at that scope. And just the amount of rendering and hardware and everything else that you've got to kind of take into consideration when you're delivering at that format. I think a lot of people won't initially kind of consider that and compensate for that, and that can cripple you. So even just slightly undermining your bid can have a massive financial hit. Okay, so keep that in mind, that like when you're working on a project and like let's say you're freelancing, if you don't deliver on time, you don't get what you promised done, worst that can happen again is that maybe you get fired. When you don't deliver on time and you're legally bound to deliver, that's something you're committed to, and you could easily get sued. A lot of bad stuff can happen. So that's kind of one of the hardest things with submitting a bid. And I'll just say that I get nervous a lot when I'm submitting a bid because there is like this magic kind of number to it, depending on like so many different factors. Even coming down to like whether or not you like that client, the pricing will change. And that's just something that, even right to the point of like when you're about to submit that bid, I've so many times gone back and just adjusted the numbers at the last minute. And it's definitely one of those things that's very nerve-wracking because when you fire it out, you could shoot too high and then they could come back and say, whoa, like this is not what we had in mind. Thanks anyway. Or just not reply, which again can happen. Whereas like you do it too low and they can say, okay, great, that sounds awesome. And then you realize like you're doing it for so low that there's no profit. And you did that because you wanted to make sure you got the job. And just like negotiating anything, it's something that you need experience in, and you need to be really, really confident in what you're doing. So, there is the whole thing about underbidding, and that's like a really big thing, is that studios will always underbid, and especially feature films where everyone wants to kind of break in and get the big jobs, everyone will try and underbid the other people. And it's only been in the past a few studios that, let's say Industrial Light and Magic, who invented this entire industry, they're able to kind of confidently say, okay, well, we're going to charge what we want because we're ILM. And these days it's not always the case. There's so many other studios that are able to compete that it's not always going to be a matter of like, well, we have the status and authority, therefore we'll get the work. But you look at Avatar as a good example, where Weta completely underbid Sony and ILM for Avatar. And what they did is they basically said, we will do revisions for free and just give us the work. And I'm sure they still managed to make a huge killing, as well as obviously get Avatar 2 and 3 and everything else. But that is something that I remember at the time, a lot of my friends at both Sony and ILM were really, really pissed off about, just because they were all bidding on that show. And I didn't know what Avatar was, but it was pretty much the big discussion at every dinner about, how Weta is going to mess it all up, and they're going to come crawling back. And what ended up happening later on is, sure, like Weta actually needed to outsource some of the stuff towards the end just because it's a massive, massive project. But it's one of those things that like they've never mentioned how much it actually cost to make, but that's definitely one of the things that did get Weta the job in the first place awarded to them. And at the same time, like I've seen projects that even recently I got asked to supervise a project, and I noticed the bid originally was like 1.2 million. I won't say where at, but 1.2 million, and then literally overnight the budget goes down to 300,000. And the workload, the schedule, everything else stays the same, and it's more because they want to get the job and they want to build a relationship with that company, and so therefore they're willing to take this big financial hit just so that they can kind of spend more time and build this relationship. So they're thinking more about the long term, and that's just something that does happen. And I don't know, like that's, I guess, everyone else's business, not mine, but it's definitely a massive, massive gamble. I will kind of quote Tobin Kirk when he's an exec producer over at Blind that did an episode, and we were talking more about artist rates, but essentially, you try and do a favor for a studio or whatever, or they ask to kind of do things on the cheap. It's very easy to kind of say like, okay, well, I'll do it this one time, but you're essentially locking yourself into that rate. Okay, so in other words, I strongly think that if you were to go to a studio and say, or an agency and say, yeah, we'll do this for 30 grand, when really it's about a 50 grand budget, the next time you come around and say, okay, well, now I need 50 grand, they're going to say, well, last time you did it for this much money. And if you want to fight that, then I'm pretty sure they're going to say, well, okay, well, we'll send out some other bids and see, who else can give us prices on this. Because at the end of the day, like, it is a business, and their job is to try and get things for cheap as they can, but still get what they want. And I think that's one thing that I will typically do a lot, is if I ever get people kind of try and undermine the bid and say, well, we found someone who can do it for cheaper. Because I think that it's really a gamble. If you go for the cheaper place, it isn't necessarily a good thing. And what I will usually say is that what you're paying for with the additional money is essentially quality assurance that the job's going to get delivered, and it's going to get delivered on time and with everything that you expect. Whereas you can go for the cheaper studio, but you're not sure about the quality of work you're getting, because if it's a lot cheaper, you're probably getting cheaper quality work. And on top of that, I would be always worried about someone who was able to do things for $20,000, $30,000, $50,000 cheaper than what maybe the other places are offering. Then that makes me kind of wonder about whether or not they've really kind of dotted their I's and crossed their T's, and they actually have been able to accurately bid this stuff out. And at the same time, like, that's something you got to be wary of too, is that you could bid something really low, and then no one's going to take you seriously. They're going to say, well, holy crap, like, this is so low, like, there's something wrong, like blatantly wrong here, compared to all the other ones that are pretty consistent. So, I think the biggest thing is just to be really confident in the numbers you've done, run the numbers, run them again, and make sure you feel right about these numbers. And I think this is like the most important thing, is that you need to stand by this and say, okay, well, these numbers feel good to me, so I'm going to send these off, and not feel like these numbers feel right to me, but I want to lower this number because I want to make sure I get the job. For me, that's going to make me feel like, well, I don't want to lower it and screw myself by saying, okay, I'm going to do it for half of this if this is the numbers that I've really like settled for. Because that way you're basically saying, okay, well, I'm going to screw myself over. And I would rather not get a job than take a job on for a lot less than what it's worth, and essentially, throw myself under the bus. So I really think it is worthwhile just kind of doing the numbers and standing by it, and knowing that this is correct and this is what you're going to submit confidently to the client. Also, just a couple of things about negotiating money. I think it's really important that you tackle everything in the beginning, and it's better to just get it all out there and not be afraid. Like, don't beat around the bush. This is a business at the end of the day, and they're making a profit, you're trying to make a profit, and money is money. It's not like you're doing it just because I love what I do and I get paid for it as a bonus. It's like you need to make sure you're doing everything right. And because this is a business and you are liable, it's better not just to assume and think that, okay, well, we didn't discuss this or that, and therefore, like, it shouldn't be a big deal. I'll bring it up later on, like once they've seen our work and they're really happy with it 3/4 of the way through the project. Get it all out in the open now and lock it all down, all the terms and everything else. And that also means that maybe discussing, like, I need money up front before I start a project. Depending on the turnaround and the budget, if something is a 2-week project, I'm probably not going to say I need 50% upfront before I start. But if this was like a 6-month project, then I'm going to sit down and say, okay, well, here's the milestone delivery that I'm proposing, which is that maybe you give me 25% upfront, and maybe then there's additional 15% and then another 50% and then the remainder upon delivery. Okay, and you work out those dates. Whatever it's going to be, it's something that then they can come back and say, okay, we agree to this or not. But I think it's very important to do. Typically, I'll say 25% up front, 50% in the middle, and then upon delivery, another 25%. And that 50%, maybe it's not in the middle, maybe it's more towards the end of the project, but then the delivery is where the final bit comes in. I think it's well worthwhile doing. And if you're afraid about asking for money up front, you can always say like, okay, this project is really big, and so we're going to need to buy some additional like software licenses as well as maybe render hardware to get it done. And therefore, like, we need that money up front we essentially need capital to purchase, this additional power that we need for rendering and everything. I think it's really important to do, and also it can work in your favor because it justifies why you need the money, and it also means that for them, they feel like, wow, like these guys are going to buy like all this additional stuff just to do this job because it's such a massive project, and that in a way can kind of really make them more happy about it. Like, yeah, like we're doing something cool that requires like this extra power or whatever. But I typically will do that. I'll say I need this much money up front, and it's important to do that because, and also to say like I'm not starting until we get this. And again, word that right. Say, we initially need 25% up front because we need it by this date so we can buy all the hardware and everything that we need so that we can hit the ground running on X date when we start production on this project. And you can emphasize that a few times leading up. You're not being annoying. You're basically saying, just a reminder, we need that milestone check to begin by tomorrow or by next week. So we just want to follow up and see where it's at. Like I said, this is a business, but having that money and kind of it's something I've seen a few times where if I have let that slip, where it's like I need that money, but then they don't get it to me in time, then I say, okay, well, we needed that money. It's like, okay, we'll chase it up. And then a few weeks go by, and then finally they're like, all right, well, we'll just merge it into the bigger milestone check we're giving you halfway through the project. So it's better to say, like, without being a dick, that you need that money by X date a week before starting because of these reasons. You're justifying like, I need computer hardware, and having that, it's kind of sets the tone of everything, and it's very easy to cause bad blood and tension between you and the clients as well as like at the studio by not having that initial payment if that's something you actually need, because midway through the project might be a month or two from now, but you might have to hire a lot of people and pay their paychecks and everything else along the way. And by not having that money, you could suddenly have all these distractions and tension in your company that you never even thought about just because, your client didn't give you your money on time, and it's suddenly caused a lot of issues. And at the same time, like, you might need to buy all that hardware, and suddenly you're working, I forget the right term I want to use here, but essentially, 50% of what you should be working at just because you don't have the hardware, and it affects the pace of how you're able to deliver stuff. So I think it's very important in the beginning to make sure that you lock down the terms, and you also make sure that they commit to them and they follow through with it. And even so, like, there's other things you need to worry about, and it's worthwhile discussing, is things like there's terms like net 30. So you might deliver your project and then you wait for final payment. And I actually had this on a really big project where most of the payment was coming at the very end. And finally we wrapped it. I had to buy a lot of hardware, and we did a lot of overtime at the end of a project, which is pretty normal to happen. And what ended up happening is that I invoiced him, and finally after a few weeks, I'm like, hey guys, like, where's the final payment? And they're like, well, we're waiting on our client Sony, and Sony's doing net 90, which means 3 months after sending an invoice, they'll get paid their big check for $1 million or whatever, and then they pay me. The thing is, technically, I never discussed net 90, so that should be on them to say, well, we'll pay you, but technically we're still waiting for our paycheck. But either way, like that really put a lot of tension on me, because if I had known that in the beginning, I would have made sure I had buffer money. But in this case, this was a few $100,000, and I literally had spent that money at that time to make sure we had hardware, everything we needed, and we really had to go all out, to get this project done. And to then go 3 months without being paid, I still need to pay my employees, and that became really, really sucky, because if I had known, I would have been ready and anticipated that. But thinking, okay, well, next week I'm going to get a check for X amount of money, and then not getting it, and still need to pay everyone and make sure that we're, able to keep afloat while we starting on the next few projects, which, gearing up for them. It's one of those things that just one little thing that you don't get clarification on in the beginning, such as here's the milestone payments, and then final delivery, which in this case was the biggest payment, is going to be delivered within 2 weeks of the invoice, because at least then if they say, well, we're going to have to wait for a paycheck from our client, then I know that, and at least then I can say, okay, well, if that's the case, then rather than 3 milestone payments, I need 4, because I'm going to need another cash infusion from you guys towards the end of the project, and then the remainder, if you guys want to do your net 90 or whatever, fine, but to kind of just leave this lump sum towards the end and not have it, that could easily close your company down. So there's things like that. It's well worth bringing everything up ahead of time and getting it locked down legally. And that's one thing. Like, there's websites out there. If you don't need a full-time lawyer to look over all your stuff. Like, you can go to places like, I think it's rocketlawyer.com, and Rocket Lawyer has essentially these templates for everything, and they've got a lot for film and visual effects. So you pretty much can type in like all the stuff that you need, like who's your client, who are you, what's the agreed terms, and it will essentially fill out these different template contracts, and you pay like $50 or whatever, and it'll send you a PDF of the final contract. So that's something you can do, that if you're trying to get a contract done on the cheap, that's something you can do, and it works pretty well. I originally got approached to VFX Soup feature film last year, and it's one of those ones that I decided not to go with. And one of the deciding points was that the production studio came to me saying, we need you to write up the film contract for us to sign. And I've never heard of a production studio not having their lawyers write up the terms. And so I ended up actually looking into it a lot, and just kind of, that was one of those things that just kind of had warning bells all over it, that like, why am I the one who's having to do all the legal work? Because that's fine, I can do that, but it's very kind of, I've never heard of that before. And because typically, like, especially in bigger films, there might be a film business lawyer that comes in who does all the contracts, and they'll make a killing. They'll make 20 grand or 30 grand just from writing up a contract for everyone to sign. And it's a big part of the business is doing that stuff of like of solidifying all the terms and everything early on. There's also other websites like LegalZoom, and what LegalZoom is, it's essentially like if you've ever used like Elance or anything to like hire a freelancer to design your website or anything like that. LegalZoom, it's like a really legit site. It's pretty heavily used by everyone, but it's essentially a place that will pair you up with the right kind of lawyer for what you need. I haven't personally used it, and I think I know more about it because I listen to so many podcasts, and a lot of the ones that I like to listen to all seem to have that as one of their sponsors. So I guess advertising is working, because it's made me kind of more aware of them. And by the way, that's not a plug for them, but that's another one where I like the idea of like, you can go there and kind of mention what you need and what your budget is. I assume, I've never looked into it, but they'll essentially pair you up with the right person for what you need. So that sort of thing I think can save a lot of time, and time again is money. So that can really be kind of make it a lot easier. It's kind of like going to websites like TaskRabbit or Uber or whatever, where you basically got an app and it's like, I need a lawyer, and you'll get one. So simple stuff like that. I mean, it's well worthwhile taking this stuff in consideration. I'm hoping that a lot of you guys who are listening are going to say, wow, I never actually thought about like all this stuff. And then I'm hoping the other half of you who have studios, because I know there's a lot of studio owners and producers on here, they're, hopefully a lot of you guys are agreeing with me and not being like, Alan, stop talking out your butt. But it's definitely like there's so much more that goes into this stuff, and it's definitely, as soon as you're an entity and as soon as you're a company basically doing this stuff, you need to cover your ass at all times. And that's why, like, I think I might have mentioned this, but it's so easy to look at the bosses being like, oh, they're making all the money, and I should be getting like all that. They're rich and I'm not, and blah blah blah. It's like, well, they're taking all the risk. They're putting everything into getting this off the ground, and you could go do it, and if you want to do it, go do it. But they've done it, and it's so easy to talk shit about other people and say like, oh, I could do what they do, but to actually get off your butt, go put yourself out to be vulnerable and to try something where you could fail, that takes discipline, and it takes a lot. And I think that says a lot about you if you're willing to do it. If you're willing to go and say, I want to start my own company, and then successfully become, make Fruit Ninja or whatever it's going to be, kudos to you. Like, but it's a lot of work, and to do it and to succeed is two different things. But to at least try and do it, I think is well worthwhile. It's definitely always going to be a risk and a gamble. So it's better to say you did it and you failed than to just not do it at all, I think, in those situations. Kind of like maybe asking a girl or a guy out. It's like, well, it's better to get rejected than to never know whether or not they would have said yes. But either way, LegalZoom and Rocket Lawyer are both two websites you can go to that at least maybe, it'll give you a bit more insight into the process that way. Now, another thing is, like, while you're talking milestones with a client, you can start to talk about deliveries and delivery schedule, as well as what to expect. So this is another thing that's like really, really important, is that you need to be able to say, okay, well, we're going to do this project, so here's the schedule for this sequence, this sequence, this sequence. Basically, we promise by this date that you will get to look at these shots, and then we promise to deliver these for temp, and then promise to deliver them for final by these dates. And this alone is almost worthwhile. Like, if you get to a scale where you have like big sequences, then having a producer or having a coordinator just solely just to focus on making sure that everyone's keeping up with where they need to be at, it's so important. And having things like Shotgun to manage this stuff, it becomes really important, because you might be so engrossed in your shots that you don't realize, like, holy crap, we promised a week ago to deliver like first pass of this stuff, and they haven't seen it. And you can be legally bound to that. And it means that if you don't deliver, especially on like a big film where you have like Fox or Paramount, someone like that, and all their lawyers, which I've mentioned, and you say like legally that you're going to show something for final by a certain date, and you don't, then you easily can get sued over that. So there's a big feature film. I was going to mention it, but I will restrain just in case, or refrain. But basically, like, there's one big movie I worked on, and we're doing this massive shot, which the whole movie was tied around this big shot. And, it was one of those things that we wanted to keep working on it. Like, it was a big movie with a big plane crashing, okay? Like, it kind of brings it down a little bit. So we wanted to keep working on the shot because it was epic, and we wanted to keep just kind of throwing everything we could at it. And it was just one of those things that, like, it was nothing negative. We were on schedule for everything, but we wanted more time on it, and it was just basically because we wanted to keep working on it. But legally, I can't remember if it was, I think it was Paramount was the client, but legally we had to show them, like, submit it for final. And if they came back and said, well, if the director came back and said, please make these changes, then that's fine. Like, we can then go and spend as long as we want on it. But we needed by that certain date to deliver it for final. And so, we had a really good relationship with the director anyway, so it's just a matter of sitting in the screening room, submitting it and saying, here's the final shot. However, what's your thoughts on like if we added, sparks, explosions, all these, additional bits and pieces? And the director says, yeah, that sounds awesome. Then you can go about doing it. But like by contract, you had to deliver it technically for final. So there's all these kind of not loopholes, but it's more about you really need to pay attention to all that stuff. And if you kind of lose track of that, it can cause a lot of shit. Now, when you're on a bigger project, especially, you need to showcase like your delivery schedule, because it's so easy, especially for clients, like if they don't know when they're seeing stuff, it's so easy for them to get really nervous about stuff because they don't know what's going on, and B, if they're getting like breathed down their neck about stuff and they don't know what to tell their client, which is usually the studio, then that's going to put you like in a really bad situation, because it's going to cause tension or pressure to them, and they're going to reflect that on you. And I've had that before. I've had some cool clients, like producers, who have been like, hey, I'm getting my ass kicked by like Paramount Pictures right now. This is a different project, but so they're like, I'm going to kick your ass because that's the way it flows. But then there's other ones that like it actually can cause like permanent stress. So if you're able to outline like, look, on this date, we're going to be showing this stuff, and on this date, we're doing another review, and we promise to have these shots delivered by these dates. That way they can look at that and they can say, okay, that sounds great, and they're in the know, which means that now they can be like, oh, where's everything at? They're like, okay, well, apparently in 2 weeks we have a review to see these shots. Okay, cool. Whereas, when they initially get proposed the review, they could say, well, we want to see more revisions, we want more sessions, or we need to see these shots ahead of time. These are higher priority. So they might give feedback, but either way, you propose that and you kind of go from there. And later on, it can become a bit of a currency where they might come back and say, you know what, like we're talking with the editor, and now the edit for the new trailer is being put together, and it looks like we need these shots done sooner. So that's when you start haggling, like, okay, well, I'll deliver these shots sooner if all these other shots we get more time to work on. So in other words, we can push them way back, and you can kind of start to play trading cards here and accommodate that. So things like that happen all the time, but that alone can actually be like a really big thing. And producing shows, like, you've got to keep on track of that, and you need to keep on top of your artist as well, because they might be working on other shots thinking like, okay, well, I'm going to work on this shot because I'm sick of looking at the other one, and they don't understand that like this shot needs to be done by next week. And if they're not aware of that, then chaos can kind of everything can get a little crazy. And also, if you commit to like a really unrealistic delivery schedule, then that can come back and bite you in the butt. At the same time, I think that the more, again, it comes with experience, but the more you kind of anticipate like the workload, you might say, okay, well, I'm going to work on, basically we're going to show only a few shots in the very beginning, and then later on everything kind of comes together very quickly. And the reason is because you might do the look development on a few what you'll call hero shots, and that is that maybe there's, let's say, I'll use Blade, like you're not going to show 50 vampires getting killed, you're going to show one. And you're going to go through this look development over and over, and they're going to say, I want more fire, I want more this, turn back this. And only once you've really locked down how that vampire is going to get killed, that's when you start to roll it out for the other shots. Otherwise, what's going to happen is you could be submitting shots for everything, and the look changes for one, it affects all of them, and you're also managing a lot of stuff at once, so your resources are spread very thin. So I think it's very important to kind of have those hero shots, and you get them locked down, and then you start to, you don't start delivering everything at once. You kind of anticipate some of the bigger ones, and you make sure you've got bandwidth in between everything, because otherwise it becomes a shit show very quickly. And at the same time, with the review process, it's always a pipe dream that you want to have like what I call a phasic process. And what it is you work on a show, you educate at the very beginning of the show, you educate them, like you send a document saying, here's how we work, and let me educate you about a few things that you might think are really easy, but they're actually very expensive. You can kind of talk about a lot of that stuff, and if they don't know much about 3D, maybe they get like a bit of a 3D 101 kind of bit of discussion in that paper. But usually you'll say, like, we're going to deliver everything initially as a model, like a turntable model. You're going to review it. You're going to say, yes, looks great, or not. Then we texture and everything, send another turntable. Once you've approved that, it goes through the rigging phase, and you start to educate people about the whole process. We don't do animation until then. Then we do blocking, and during that time, maybe we're doing previs for the whole thing, but then we'll block the animation out. If you're happy with the beats, everything will then go through and do second pass, and then we'll do final animation. And then once there's final animation done, we'll go through and we'll do cloth and hair. Meanwhile, lighting is being done, and eventually it moves into effects. And usually lighting and effects happens around the same time, but then it's more effects and compositing are the last two in the pipeline. So you, in a pipe dream, you propose that, and you say, if at any time we show the stuff, you approve it, we cannot go back, because you can't change the animation without it affecting the cloth animation, you know what I mean? But at the same time, as much as you'll communicate that, it's pretty hard for you not to, unless you have like a good producer and a good client, and your producer's kind of very much on this. It's very easy for you to say, okay, like everything's approved, we're going to animation, we're now doing the explosion, and then the client says, well, I want the guy being blown up by the explosion to be reanimated because I'm not happy with the way he kind of flails his arms or whatever. And suddenly you got to go and redo all the cloth, the hair, everything, the lighting, for the hero shot, whatever, and it affects everything. So at that point, you're kind of either faced with going back to the drawing board, and it's going to cost a lot of money, or you propose like, okay, well, we have already approved all of this, and we can go back and adjust that, but it will cost more money. And that's kind of one of those things that, like, I've numerous times, as long as I communicate that and over communicate that in the beginning, it usually means that it's received well. And if this is an important change, then the director or the client usually is able to say, okay, that's fine, like, we want this change, we'll pay for it. If you haven't been communicating so far and you haven't really kind of made it obvious to them, like, look, we're approving this, and I'm mentioning we cannot go back from this point, and then they do, that is something that it can create some ill will. Okay, so I think it's well worthwhile mentioning, like, hey, we've talked about this a lot, and we can do this, but it's going to kind of throw everything out of whack, and this means we need more time as well as possibly more cash. So, all those discussions, they sound really trivial, but they are really, really important. And at the same time, like, I've seen this a lot where I will say, okay, well, we can do that, but remember when we discussed, like, locking the stuff down and you approved it all, we can go back and do it, but it's going to cost more money. And suddenly that change that they're really adamant about, they're like, I'm actually happy with how it is right now. So that can sometimes be a good thing. So keep that in mind. And, like, this is where having a producer, and I don't think it's a good idea initially to have a producer when you're starting a company. It's a lot of extra overhead, and I will get into this a little bit if I have time. But having a producer means you've got like a bad guy, a fall guy, someone that sometimes you can play the good guy, a good cop, and they play the bad cop. So this is something where if the client says, like, well, I want to have all these changes, then you say, okay, well, the producer, basically, it's their job to say, well, that's not in the budget, and we can go and figure it all out, but it's probably going to cost more money. Whereas, like, as an artist or as the creative director, you're not usually able to say, like, no, you didn't ask for this initially and we didn't bid it. Usually it's something that you want to play the yes, we can give you whatever you want role, and you need the producer to be the one who's got your back. And I've seen sneaky shit where I've had clients come in and they discuss a bunch of stuff, And then as they're all leaving the room, they'll run up to an artist and they'll say, hey, do me a favor, just if you could go and like change those birds and make them like a little bit quicker and do this and this, like that'd be awesome. And typically the artists have no idea what's going on, and if the producer doesn't catch that, then they're getting free stuff basically, and they know that they're doing it on purpose. And so that's one thing that occasionally will happen, is that if you mention like to the supervisor or to the producer like, oh yeah, I've got to do this thing the client asked for, and they're like, well, when did that happen? Then that's when they're like, okay, hold off of that for the time being, I'll talk to the client. And they go back and say, hey, I noticed you spoke to my artist, we can do that, but it's going to be more money. And again, there's like a lot of those kind of, especially in advertising, there's a lot of games that get played in that regard about getting stuff done for free basically. But keep that stuff in mind, because it is really vital to think about. And I remember on a movie a few years ago, I was CG supervisor on it, and basically I was with the director and with the owner of the studio as well, and the director wanted more changes done to a certain shot. They were really happy, but they're like, man, it'd be so cool, if we had like this one extra change. And this is again one of those things that having a producer or having someone who's more of a people person can be really beneficial, because like not everyone who owns a company is going to be a people guy, okay? And this is a situation where I don't think I've ever been in more of a tense situation than I was that day, where obviously it's stressful because the director is asking for something that is going to cost a few $100s or a few $1,000s to do. And I mentioned that before, the psychological kind of effect it has of being a business owner, I can relate to what happened. But basically the owner just started flipping out, saying like, you're not getting that change, when the director's like, hey, like, everyone's happy at that point, until he basically says like, no, we're not giving you that. And it was so tense that the director had to kind of laugh and try and break the tension in the room, because everyone's silent. And again, like, I'm sure all of us want to jump in and kind of play rescue to the situation and say, I mean, it's so easy if you had a producer, because like the producer of the production was Chris Brown, who is a pretty big shot guy at Lionsgate, I think. And he wasn't there for that specific conversation, and we didn't have a producer on our end, because it was very much a being done for cost production. And having a producer, all that would have needed to have actually happened was the director says, hey, what would be really cool, can we get this one extra thing happen? And the producer says, okay, I'm not sure if that's in our budget, or I think we've already gone through our cap on revisions, so let me talk to Chris and I'll see if we can figure something out. That's all that needs to be said, and that way he can go to Chris, who's the boss. Like, the director doesn't have final say on this, like the money gets taken care of by the producer, and that's who the director reports to. So he would just need to say, yeah, I'm not paying for that, that's not in the budget, and the director has to abide by that. But for you to kind of tell the director, like, yeah, we're not giving you that, I guarantee that one moment ruined like there being ever any chance of that director ever working with that studio ever again. Like, that relationship was dead before I even left the room that day. And thing is too, like, I've worked with Michael Bay and a lot of other big directors, and it's very easy to piss off some directors, and other directors are cool as shit, but again, if you can slip up and there can be a lot of miscommunication. So having someone there to play bad cop means that you guys, or at least kind of handle the business end of things, means that you can be the creative and you can say, wow, that'd be so freaking cool, and then come back with like, yeah, like I guess like, the budget for this shot is completely blown out, and like, we couldn't figure anything out, that sucks. You want to be aligned with the creatives, and that way you guys can flow, you can do what you want. That's what I really loved about Frantic Films, was that Ken Zorniak was the producer and Chris Bond was the creative, and that studio worked so well because Chris was, is such a creative and imaginative guy, and like he's on Superman, he's such a big comic buff. Like he would walk in the room wearing his brand new Tron shoes / Tron jacket, and be all kind of hyped up that he got all his new gear, and is this kind of guy that like just loved what he did. He loved comics, loved what he does, and he can say, I want to have like this, and this, and this, and you can have the producer who's going to be looking at the books and saying, well, we can only do this and this. And it's kind of like the yin and yang. You have that really good balance between what's going to cost money to do and what can be done, and then having the creative person who doesn't need to worry about the limitations creatively. They can do whatever they want and have someone else ground them back down. And I think that's such a really beautiful relationship to have in business. Now, I'm just going to jump onto just in terms of like money again for a moment, but in Australia there's a thing called mates rates, and that essentially means kind of like a discounted rate based on like your relationship with that client or with that person. And it's a pretty common thing. For instance, like Activision would have a relationship with a lot of game studios where they would essentially, for the price of loyalty, they would get more favorable bids. So in other words, the studios would get return business from Activision, and in return Activision would get a cheaper bid than they would if they went to like a brand new studio. So there's situations like that. Like I'm always kind of against like working for free and things like that, but there's also times when being more strategic about taking a little bit of a hit. This isn't the same as underbidding. This is essentially, you've got a business relationship, and because of that, they know they're getting the best deal possible, and you know that you're getting all their business. And those sorts of things are more long-term business strategies, and I think it's well worthwhile to identify the difference between underbidding a project and having mates rates. And that's something I think that exists all over the world. I just don't think there's really like a term for it. And I think Australia, like as much as we are big on business, we're also able to be kind of lenient in terms of how we might name stuff or how we do stuff. And I do really like the business mindset in most areas of Australia. Just like the way that we do stuff is all about relationships, and it's all about getting it done and not being stressed about it, but doing a good job. Like Aussies usually work really hard. They have very strong work ethic, but at the time you're going to have beer o'clock, you're going to have a life, and you're going to try and get shit done. And you make sure that the business you do, it's all about that long-lasting relationship. So, going out for beers with a client and making sure they're having a good time. And I think there's like a really solid and healthy mentality, especially with business in Australia. So another thing, I've mentioned this before in different circumstances, but I think one of the most powerful things or powerful words that I've ever seen when it comes to business is the R word. In other words, relationships. I don't know why this is, but especially as a studio owner, any time I ever use that word, in other words, I'd be talking with other studios, with other clients, and I would say it a lot, and I don't mean to say it in like throwing it around too lightly, but I would say like, hey, I really enjoy working with you guys. I would love to build a stronger relationship with your studio. I don't know why, but I swear I would always see a little kind of like twinkle in their eye, like almost like it's love right there. And I don't know why. For me, it was just something I kind of stumbled upon, but I really think that anytime, and I don't throw it around lightly, but anytime I have kind of essentially said like, hey, I'd love to build like a stronger relationship with you guys, or build a bigger relationship with your studio and the business we do, it's changed everything. Like that client suddenly will be a lot more communicative with me. Like they'll start like talking more about big picture stuff. They'll start really kind of wanting to do a lot more work together. And even, there's been a few times where I've gotten to direct some pretty big projects, and I never had positioned myself as a director or really saw myself as one until, I guess, using the R word. But like there were a lot of positions starting to come up where they're like, hey, we want to build like a bigger relationship with you. We'd love for you to actually come on and direct this project for us, and we'll be, outsourcing a lot of the shots to you guys. What do you think? And so I've had a lot of opportunities come up from those situations, and it's been a bit of it's one of those big realizations where it's made me think like, wow, like what happened there? And you kind of deconstruct those successes, and it's like, well, was it because I said this and this and this? And yeah, I don't know what it is, but it's always been one of those things. And it's not like you're saying like, I want to exclusively work with you and not no one else, or anything like that. It's all you're basically saying is that like, you value their business and you want to talk about like bigger picture stuff, or you'd love to work more with them. It can mean so many things. So that's what I've always found. It's just such an odd thing that I've always found with anything to do with business. The R word can be really effective. And since then I've applied it to so many areas, like, just in terms of freelancing or anything else, using the R word has gotten really good results. And it's kind of like, it's not the same thing, but it's kind of like when you say like you're in bed with Microsoft or whatever. All you're saying with that is that you're in a business relationship with that company. It doesn't mean that you and Tim Cook or anything is like doing stuff on the sly or anything, but yeah, you're essentially just building like a solid business relationship. And I think the key thing is that you want to build these relationships with everyone. It's not that gimme, but more about big picture. How can we, look at, making things work even more effectively? And that's what ultimately everyone wants, is to get things done as cheap as they can, but also have as much stability in what they do. You don't want curveballs, you don't want unforeseeable problems. So the more you work with someone, the more familiar you guys are with each other, the more consistent and predictable things become, which in business is a good thing. So there's so much more ridiculous. I actually wrote so many notes, and this was I will only cover like 10% of what I want to cover thing, but because like this is something I actually have thought about building a book on, just because I think that a lot of people, it's such a gray area, no one really understands much about. But yeah, I'm literally going to end it just after this, but I'm just going to say like the other thing is about making sure whatever work you do, that the client you got to compensate for what the client knows about what you're doing. It's so easy to say, okay, well, I'm going to fire out a play blast tomorrow and you guys can check it out. And you send a preview or play blast, whatever you want to call it, like a grayscale, Gouraud shaded or, blend shaded, wireframe animation of like preview of what you're doing. And you will get clients occasionally freak out. Like, I paid $2 million for this. And it's like, no, like this is just a preview. And they're like, or a play blast. And like, what the fuck is a play blast? You need to understand that. Like Michael Bay, I mentioned before, that he's definitely someone that you cannot show work in progress stuff very easily. Like he's someone who you need stuff to be pretty much at final before he sees it. Otherwise, he's going to be like, what the fuck is this shit? And things get pretty wild. And James Cameron, I've heard a lot of stories about him from people who've been fired because basically he kind of got really hot-headed about certain things. So, I mean, there are those sorts of directors that you need more of a controlled environment when you're producing stuff, showing stuff out to them. But in general, like, for me, this was a big realization when I was 18 and we landed this $2 million job from Samsung. And this project, it actually wasn't 2 million, it was just under $1 million. But basically, this was like at the time one of the biggest projects, if not the biggest we'd ever done. And basically what happened is we showed them some of our stuff, like what we were doing. And what happened was the studio across from us, GMD or Garner McLaren Design, they sneakily did some tests of their own and sent them along as well. The difference is that ours were literally just previews, like play blasts. What they had done is rendered it with lighting. And the thing is that, like, in our head, we were going to deliver amazing stuff, but we were just showing the animation at that point. It was like this fly-through of all this stuff for the first ever HD TV in Australia. Because this was 2000, around the time when HD TV was coming out. So this was the first Samsung HD TV. Sorry, this is just trickling back to me. But yeah, we showed a play blast, and GMD across the street went and rendered something and lit it. So it had a bit of color and it was lit. So instantly, Samsung was like, this is way better than what we've seen by these guys, pulled the job from us and gave it to GMD. And I don't know, like for me, that was like one of those aha moments where I realized that presentation is everything, and you really need to wow people all the time. Like with my courses, I've with the mentorship, stuff like that, to kind of segue for a moment, I've kind of made this realization about anything that I do that I want to be proud of it, not just now, but 5 years from now. And so there's been things that I've worked on and I've pulled because I just felt like a year later they weren't where they were at. And with my mentorship, it's something where I would over-deliver on that because I felt like I want to be proud of that forever. I want this to be like the best quality that I can produce, and I can overproduce it so that way I feel good about it and I will stand by this thing for the test of time. And this isn't a pitch. It's actually pretty much closed, or will be closing this week, so don't worry. But for me, like, that's the sort of thing that for me, I kind of got a lot of this mindset, this mentality, these habits from my experiences growing up in this industry. And I would make these realizations that, like, you might make something amazing, but if you don't, if 90% of it is amazing and 10% at the beginning isn't, then that's all it takes for someone to get nervous and pull out of doing something. And so you want to make sure the experience that you give to a client from day one is all about getting their confidence and getting them to completely believe in you and trust in you. So that way they will let you have the reins and do what you got to do. And that's what they're hiring you for. So that way you can get the job done and get it out. Otherwise, like, you could lose that $1 million job that you've already started working on because someone else came along and just literally rented out some colored version of what you've been doing as well. So there's literally so much more I wanted to go into, and it's just a matter of right now being pretty much at the 2-hour mark. So, these are the sorts of things that I do have a lot of experience in, and rather than being like, I think some of the episodes I've been putting together lately have not been structured episodes in the way that, like, episode 1 would be a very structured bullet point, do this. But for me, these are the things that I've got so much experience in. They're also things that I'm talking about because I so adamantly believe in this sort of thing. Like, getting mentors, for instance, is something that it's funny. Some of the podcasts I listen to are James Altucher, Tim Ferriss. There's a lot of, like, really amazing podcasts out there. And putting out the episode on mentorship last week, James Altucher was how to get a mentor, how to get any mentor in the world. And then there's a couple other ones. Tim Ferriss was talking to Noah Kagan, which was a brilliant episode as well. And again, talking about the power of, like, importance of getting a mentor in your life or multiple mentors. So it's kind of funny, like, the timing of it. And I almost wish that I waited a week just because there's so much insight I'm sure I could have gotten from their episodes that I could have maybe kind of stolen and implemented. But yeah, I mean, stuff like that I mentioned because I so adamantly to the bitter bones of my body believe is so vital to success and having success in your life. Now, at the same time, like, just again kind of going on a bit of a tangent here, but I do think that for me the goal of talking about this is because I've had a lot of people contact me now about, like, advice on setting up a company or setting up a studio, working from home, or how to bid on projects. And I will try and send to the insiders, like, VIP list. I will try and put together some documentation, like letters on how to write a bid, what to say to clients. There's a lot of stuff like that. I'm going to start structuring my days around actually trying to put out, like, a couple of emails a month to the list, which I think will be really valuable. But that is something that, I think is just as important to kind of filter a lot of you, or make you a bit more aware of, like, yeah, launching a company can be really great, but at the same time, like, it can, it is a bit of a game changer. You're not playing in I hate calling it cattle, but I think that in this mentality, like, working for a company, like, you're essentially following. You're brought on as a service, you're providing, you can do so much there, but at the same time, like, there's a leader, and they're also the one who has got to be responsible for everyone else. And so when I say cattle, it's not a derogatory term. It's essentially that this one person is responsible for all of you. And so they're the one that's vulnerable to, like, losing money and all these other things. They're the one taking a hit for you. If you screw up so adamantly that they lose money, you're not no one's going to come to you and say, well, you owe us money or we're going to sue you. You just lose your job or whatever. You get told, don't do it again. But they could potentially lose like tens of thousands of dollars or like so many bad things. And so once you start playing in that circle, it's a whole other thing. And I think that, like I said, the first thing I mentioned was just kind of do a bit of internal searching as to why you want to do this. I mentioned that girl saying that she wants to run multiple corporations, not interested in like learning how businesses run, just multiple corporations. And I know plenty of guys who want to be the boss, and that's what they want to do. And so I mentioned all this just because it's important to find like why your heart is set on this. If you want to do beautiful animation because you're inspired growing up doing that, and you want to make your own animated films, or whatever it is that drives you, that's fine. Just make sure that you actually know what it is that's pushing you, rather than it being like, I just want to be the boss. Like, that is not a good enough reason, in my opinion. So I'll leave it there. I hope that resonates with a lot of you, and I will probably do a follow-up because, again, there's so much to this, and I hope that at least like the bidding stuff kind of at least gives a bit of insight, both into maybe not as much the process, but things to look out for and why. And at the same time, more just kind of insight into the industry as well. So that is it for now. I'm going to leave it there. A couple of things I'm just going to rattle off. Next episode, I think I'm going to finally announce the reel review stuff. There's a couple of things that I've mentioned before, and I guess if we're going to talk about them right now, basically, I want to start doing some webinars pretty soon, which will be a chance to work with a lot of you personally. Like, I want to do some live webinars where I will go through a lot of really high value content, kind of like the podcast, but I want to more work with you guys as well. So this would be a chance to kind of do some live Q&A, as well as maybe do a bit more of like an intensive with a few of you guys. So that way, if you're like, hey, I'm working on this job, or I'm trying to get my career going, I want to switch to, whatever role, whatever I want to do, we can kind of work together on that stuff live. And I think it's going to be a lot of fun. I've been in a lot of masterminds where, you as a group work on a lot of stuff, and it's not really quite the same thing, but I think this would be like a really powerful, really valuable thing for everyone. At the same time, I want to start doing live reviews, and I have, I'm just going to throw this out there, because I've talked to like Todd Sheridan Perry, for instance, about this, and he agreed a long time ago. A few people have, but I haven't actually kind of been like, okay, let's set a date. But next episode, I will set a date, and I will say that he's up first. I've got to go and follow up with him again. But what the idea will be is that I will get everyone that wants their reels reviewed to submit their reel. And what we'll do is, as many as we can, we'll go through a list and we'll give you feedback. We'll critique your work, and we'll do it all live as a group. So in other words, you guys all log into a webinar platform, and we'll essentially like look through the work, pretty similar to what I do with CG Society. And we can give advice about like, okay, these shots work great, I would work on this more, these things here work really well. And again, like Todd is someone who's worked on like everything from Lord of the Rings. He's got an Emmy. He's really well established. He's a visual effects supervisor. He hires and assembles teams all the time. So we're the kind of people that typically are looking at reviews and at reels and trying to pick out who gets hired for a job. So in this case, it's essentially we're the target audience that would be looking at your stuff, and so getting some insight into like what our first impression is. I've mentioned it before, but like I've seen people go from being the top of the list to the bottom of the list because maybe the way that their logo, their name came up when it came to like call me or whatever wasn't like quite right, and just essentially put them to the bottom of the list. And it's such simple things that can completely throw everything off. So those two things are going to be, I think, really, really big. I'm going to announce probably both of them, or at least the real stuff, next episode, so keep an eye out for that. I also have a lot of really cool interviews coming up, so not solo stuff, but interviews. But I want to hold off announcing all these. Basically, I've been consumed for the last 2 months with this mentorship and getting everything launched for round 2, and finally this is the last week of it. And so we close the doors this coming Saturday. Well, technically Sunday the 17th is when the doors officially close. I will say the first time we went through this, there were 150 people allowed in, and I'll say the funnel, and essentially like when you sign up, get all the videos and everything, like a sample basically of what it is. There was 1,800 people going through that funnel. So this time around, there's probably only about 100 positions available, yet there's over 25,000 people have signed up for the funnel. So officially doors have opened today. I don't know how long they're going to be open for. It's going to be really interesting. But, either way, like, I will mention the link actually, just because basically what I did is I wanted to put out a lot of really valuable content. And at the same time, like, if this is something you really like, then you'll get a chance to sign up. And I wanted to do it because I didn't want to just say, like, sign up if you want to. I wanted people who went through the content to have access to it, because otherwise, like, you might just sign up, and I only want people who actually have been following for the 5 videos, or in this case 7 videos that I put out, like 10 hours of content, that you get an idea of what you want. And I only wanted people who are like, yeah, this is something I'm wanting to do for a year, because it's like a 1-year mentorship. So this is something that I only wanted people who watched all the videos, did all the content, interacted with me, and were like, yeah, this is right for me to do it, rather than me just putting out publicly and saying sign up. But at the same time, like, you don't need to sign up. So if you want to get over 10 hours of free video, this content will be available for this week. So May 17, because this is content from the mentorship, it's like a tiny smidgen of a sample of what's on in there, because like this is training for a week. Well, imagine what we do for a year. But if you want to take a look at this free video stuff, enjoy it, download it while you can, go to www.allanmckay, so ALLANMCKAY.com/ash, so ASH, and that, just put in your email address, and for the next few days you'll get sent all the videos. I would do it right away, because end of the week, May 17, I have to take all that stuff down, because it's property of the mentorship, and I promised only to keep it around for that time up until registration. But like I said, you don't need to sign up for anything. If you want to, great, but you might as well enjoy it while it's there, because it's about to go away. All right, so next week's going to be a big one, and like I said, finally this mentorship is going to be over this week. So there's going to be a lot of big stuff I've got coming up for the podcast. So there's actually a lot of guys from Pixar, as well as a few other big studios that I'm going to be bringing in, like really big names that you probably associate with Pixar when you think of Pixar. So there's actually a lot of really big stuff, and I've kind of keep putting it off the last couple of weeks, just because I've been flat out. I've worked for the last 2 months on this launch, on top of the just doing stuff for the mentorship. Officially, as of today, of the day the podcast is announced, I've agreed to come back to Paris next year to do a lot of really cool stuff. I'm having a meeting this week to talk over all of it with the guys, but this is going to be epic. We got like Mark Terriault from ILM. He's going to be there. Anselm, Anzi, who's done an episode for the podcast, he's going to be there. Mark Simonetti, who is world famous for his illustrations, and I'm just going to put this out there that I'm going to get him on the podcast. He's one of the few people that I need to chase up, but I'd love to get Mark on here, so I'm just going to throw it out there, and it'll be my way of making myself accountable for following up on that. So I'm going to leave it there, guys. I appreciate if you made it to the end of this podcast. The Moby Dick myth of one day I will do a 30-minute episode. One day, it's just too much information to get through, but I really hope that you found this valuable. For me, this is definitely, one of those things that like I'm putting this together because I think this is information that a lot of you, even if you don't intend to ever start a business, you will find really valuable. And so that is it. If you want the free videos, or more information on the mentorship, go to alanmckay.com/ash, so ASH. I'll leave a link in the show notes. Only available for this week, and then I will not be opening the doors again until next year, if I do it again, because for me I took a year off to focus on this, so it's kind of one in a lifetime kind of thing. So we'll see, but I'll leave it there. Thanks for listening, guys, and I'll be back next week with some really cool material.